Hello guys, this is What About Nintendo, and today I'm here for another Pokemon Sword and Shield graphic comparison. Last time I compared it to Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee, as well as Pokemon Sun and Moon. But today I'm going to compare it to Game Freak's other 2019 Nintendo Switch project, Town. Got a lot to go over, so let's get right on into it. Alright, first off, before we get into the nitty gritty, let's go over the image quality real quick for both games. I pixel counted both Town and Sword and Shield, and both come out at a full native 1080p, minus the industrial areas of Sword, which I'm sure will get a bump in res by the release of that game. As for anti-aliasing, as is tradition by now, with both the Pokemon Company and Nintendo, this game lacks any sort of anti-aliasing whatsoever, which really detracts from the overall image quality and makes that native 1080p much less impressive than it should be. Now, with resolution out of the way, let's start with the first thing that jumped out to me when I saw both of these trailers, and that is the incredible draw distance. Both games have you seeing very far off in the distance, with very little in terms of pop-in, even for shadows and foliage. We also see the same great smoke effects as in Sword and Shield, with mist coming from the waterfalls and smoke coming from the chimneys very far into the background. However, I'd have to give draw distance to Town as a win in this regard. The distance you can see into the background of Town is incredible, and was a stunning sight to behold from the first moment of the trailer. While Pokemon Sword's draw distance is good, it replaces many things like 3D modeled trees for 2D images at a distance, which Town does not do. As we go along, we'll see some other ways that Town beats out Pokemon Sword in terms of draw distance and background detail, as well as why this isn't always a huge deal. Next up, however, as a sort of counterpoint to the better draw distance, is that you'll also notice that there is actually just less to draw in for Town. Let's talk trees and foliage. Pokemon Sword and Shield definitely beat out Town in this regard, with some beautifully rendered grass, tons of trees and bushes, and just generally a very packed amount of foliage filling out the environment. Town, however, has much less of this. While it has some grass, it's not very dense at all, and it's very low resolution, honestly resembling something that I expect to see in a 3DS game. There are at times some flowers strewn about, some wheat patches that resemble that of Pokemon Sword, and it all blows around nicely in the wind, but I have to say, all in all, the foliage in Town is definitely its weakest point. It's a similar situation for trees and bushes. Pokemon Sword is filled to the brim with them, even if many of the distant ones are 2D images. There are plenty of 3D model trees that go around, whereas in Town, these are much more sparse, although there is still a good amount of them. Trees and bushes in Town are also much less detailed than Sword and Shield, with very simple geometry and basic textures. Speaking of textures, let's talk texture quality. First things first. Both games have bad texture filtering. It's a sad truth, where there doesn't seem to be any anisotropic filtering at all, and if there is, it's very low quality. Textures blurring at an angle is a common sight for both of these games. However, at an optimal viewing angle, we see some major differences between the textures themselves. Town sports very simple, albeit very clean looking textures that, while unimpressive in detail for the most part, look very polished. Pokemon Sword and Shield, however, goes for a much more detailed approach. Everything has a very textured look to it, like the walls and carpets in this house, and sports some nice detail, like the pebbles strewn across this path. However, the complexity betrays it in a way, since getting closer to the texture reveals their low-res nature and makes them look a bit muddier than Town's. Overall, in terms of technical detail, Sword and Shield takes the cake, but Town's simplistic design is a bit more appealing in my opinion. However, if by release, Sword and Shield's textures get a bit more polished, I think they can look very nice. This next point shares a similar story to the textures, and that is shadow quality. As I said, it's a very similar situation to textures. Once again, Town sports a very low detail, but very clean and polished looking effect. It's more of a blob than a detailed shadow map, but it gets good coverage, has great draw distance, and is backed up with some nice ambient occlusion. Pokemon Sword and Shield, however, go for a much more detailed approach, backed nicely with even more ambient occlusion than Town, and for the most part it works well, except that some of the shadows are very low resolution. For example, the player character shadow, and the shadow from large trees. If they could just fix the resolution of the shadows in Sword and Shield, they would look great, but at this point, Towns look much more polished. However, something that Town does not have, that looks amazing in Sword and Shield, is dynamic cloud shadows. These are everywhere in Sword and Shield, on the mountains, on the hills, on the roads, everywhere you look are these beautiful cloud shadows sweeping over the environment, stretching far out in the distance. It's quite stunning. Town is lacking the feature entirely, and it's sorely missed in that game. Next on the list is water detail. Another thing that sets Sword and Shield apart from Game Freak's previous games is the water rendering. It's much more realistic than usual, sporting nice, rippling waves and some pretty reflections from some surprisingly high detailed cube maps. Town, however, as you probably expect by this point, takes a much simpler approach with very basic looking water that, while not being bad, is also not at all impressive. Unlike the shadows and textures, the water in Sword and Shield is a clear winner here for me personally. It just looks super good. However, I do have to say that the waterfalls in Town are very nice, and unfortunately, I don't see any on the map for Sword and Shield's Galar region. Next up is character models. A quick little segment here, as it's mostly the same story as the rest of the game. Town is a very simple character model with extremely basic textures and shading, while Sword and Shield goes for a much more realistic approach, with more realistic proportions and a higher detailed textures and shaders. There's no real winner here, it's all up to personal preference. Finally, let's talk battles. First thing that jumped out to me about the battles in Town is that they're not in a separate arena like in Pokemon games. They're just in the overworld exactly like it is when you're exploring. This is a major upgrade over Sword and Shield, as it means it completely ditches the 2D background elements and instead renders everything in 3D, just like in Exploration, showing once again the superior draw distance of this game. While Town wins in the draw distance and background detail department, Pokemon Sword and Shield definitely win this next category, which is effects work. Town's battle effects are, well, highly unimpressive. To be fair, we haven't seen a lot of the battles in Town, but what was shown off was pretty basic. Even basic moves in Sword and Shield look considerably more impressive, with particles and bloom, while even more flashy moves have screen rippling effects and motion blur. From the footage we have so far, Pokemon Sword and Shield definitely wins in terms of effects. So yeah guys, that's it though for my comparisons of Town and Sword and Shield. Quicker analysis, but one that I think was filled with a lot of good information. Overall, I prefer how Pokemon Sword and Shield looks, but you cannot deny that Town looks a lot more polished in several different areas. But then again, both of these are unreleased games. Pokemon Sword and Shield could very well get a lot of graphical upgrades to things like shadow detail and textures, while Town may get some nicer grass resolution or something like that. So we'll have to wait until they finally release in order to really tell how they're gonna stack up as final products, but for now they each look good in their own ways. Anyways guys, that's all for this video. If you like this video, please hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and ring that bell icon for notifications of all my videos. Also, let me know down in the comments below of which one do you prefer. Do you prefer the simplistic look of Town, or do you prefer the more detailed but sort of flawed look of Pokemon Sword and Shield? Let me know down in the comments below. Anyways guys, I'll see all you awesome people later on One Bit Nintendo. Bye!